The death last Friday of former South African President Nelson Mandela resulted in a flood of international tributes. But there's been bickering over who from New Zealand should attend his funeral, as some old wounds from 1981 have resurfaced. Professor of International Relations Robert Patman is here to give his thoughts. Good evening.
Good evening.
Tell us about the international response to Mr Mandela's death.
It's been remarkable. There's been an outpouring, of course, within South Africa, although interestingly many South Africans have celebrated, not mourned, the death of someone who's a much-loved figure in South Africa, but there's been a remarkable response internationally. Something like 60 heads of state are going to Mr Mandela's funeral, and I think he was a person who not only moved people within his own country, but certainly made a potent connection overseas as well.
Now, many people here will remember the calls for free Nelson Mandela in 1981. Would you say that New Zealand has a special relationship with the South African leader?
Well, certainly Mr Mandela made a point in 1995, shortly after becoming the new president of South Africa, which in itself was a remarkable development. He made a point of saying that he was very conscious when he was in prison of the anti-apartheid protests in New Zealand. And of course South Africa and New Zealand were linked by their mutual love of rugby, but they were also multiracial societies. And so he was enormously heartened, he said, in 1990, he said when he recalled the event, he was heartened when he was in prison in 1981 to know that New Zealanders across the board were speaking out against apartheid. Now, of course, not all New Zealanders were speaking out against it, and that's partly the row about the composition of the delegation that's gone to South Africa, and still that arguments from 1981 reverberate on.
What effect would you say the actions of those who protested have had?
Very difficult to quantify them, but I think if we're to believe Mr Mandela, they gave some heart to those who were imprisoned and gave them a sense of going on. And although they were being incarcerated, Mr Mandela was incarcerated for 27 years. But it's interesting that when he left prison, as he put it, he left his hatred and enmity behind. He said he would have remained a prisoner if he continued to adhere to those values. And that I think the thing that inspired many people, both within South Africa and outside it, is here as a person who personally suffered because of his beliefs, but was willing to extend the hand of friendship to those who were responsible for his suffering. And it was incredible leadership. The breadth and generosity of his leadership, I think, captivated the world and showed that perhaps societies which are bitterly divided can still cohere in those circumstances.
What are your thoughts on the makeup of John Key's entourage to South Africa?
Well, I guess John Key would say it's very difficult to get it right, given how divisive the Springboks tour of 1981 was. I think he could have been perhaps slightly more magnanimous. I think John Minto, who was a very prominent anti-apartheid activist, wasn't included in the delegation. However, John Key would argue that he's included the leader of the opposition, David Cunliffe, and he's also included Peter Sharples, who was an anti-apartheid activist during the 70s and 80s. So it is one of those issues that it's interesting that several decades back, and yet there still continues to be arguments amongst New Zealanders about the composition of the delegation.
Is the model of reconciliation used following the end of apartheid regime something that others have learned from?
Not enough, I would say. I think one of the things that helped South Africa cohere was that Mr Mandela presided over the establishment of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was a wonderful safety valve for a society which had a lot of pent-up hatreds and awful memories. But other societies have yet to follow that example. The other thing is Mr Mandela stood down after 5 years as president, and as Desmond Tutu said recently, many other African leaders would do well to follow Mandela's example, because in sub-Saharan Africa there is a tendency for African leaders to try and see them maintain their position for the rest of their lives. Mr Mugabe next door, for example, has manipulated elections on many occasions to stay in power for the best part of 3 decades, and there was no love lost between Mr Mandela and Mr Mugabe.
Professor of International Relations Robert Patman, thanks very much for your time.